In a recent team meeting, an employee excitedly presented a new idea they'd been working on as the team discussed various project updates. Instead of acknowledging the effort, though, the leader dismissively remarked, "That's been tried before and it failed. Didn't you do your homework?" The room fell silent, and the employee, visibly deflated, retreated into their chair, their enthusiasm replaced by embarrassment. This undermining remark of the leader sent a ripple of unease through the team, stifling further creative input and collaboration. I mean, who wants to speak up and risk being embarrassed by their boss and humiliated in front of their teammates? The leader's thoughtless comment, meant as a quick critique, publicly shamed the employee, demonstrating a lack of emotional intelligence and understanding of the impact of their words. Sound familiar? Stay tuned as we show you just how often this happens.
Welcome to Dismantling Dysfunction, a podcast series for anyone who is ready to eliminate the dysfunction they experience in their organizations, leaders, or relationships. Each week, we explore common dysfunctions in organizations, delving into the systemic causes behind them, and giving you the exact tools and practical tips you need to dismantle them. Now, here are your hosts, organizational development and behavioral change experts, Dr. Anne Dranitsaris and Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. We're continuing our series on accountability, tackling this widespread issue of its dysfunction within organizations. In our previous episode, we explored one of the top behavioral impediments to accountability, narcissistic tendencies amongst leaders. And we highlighted some of the ways in which leaders protect themselves from their insecurities, errors, or incompetence by blaming or devaluing employees when things go wrong. They focus more on looking like a great leader than actually developing their people. But today, we're going to shift our focus a little bit. Subtle yet damaging aspect of leadership we're going to talk about today, unconscious shaming and its impact on accountability. This issue deserves our attention as we tackle the complex challenges of workplace accountability. But before we continue, make sure that you've hit the subscribe button if you're catching us on YouTube. Turn on the notification bell to stay updated on our latest leadership videos. If you're catching us live on LinkedIn, make sure that you are following us so that you don't ever miss out on any of our videos on leadership, and we can keep you up to date. So with that, let's explore the hidden blockers to accountability caused by unconscious shaming.
Hey everyone, and thanks for joining us today. Shaming and accountability aren't really two words that you hear very often together, but shaming is actually a common tool that helps us get people to submit to what we want them to do when we're actively using it. And let's face it, we use it in parenting, with partners, and in leadership, but we don't always know that we're doing it. That's why we're talking about unconscious shaming. It's that we're using something as a tool to get what we want. And in the context of organizations, leaders use it simply because they've always talked like that or they've been talked to like that themselves, and not really thinking about its negative impact on accountability when they unintentionally shame or demean employees through their words or actions. These behaviors often stem from biases, unexamined assumptions, or simply a lack of awareness of the impact of their behavior on others, one of the key tenets of emotional intelligence. Examples include things like public criticism, dismissive language, or making sarcastic comments, really without recognizing the harm that they cause.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I think about one of our clients who has a tendency towards doing this, and it is very unconscious. It's a communication approach. Unfortunately, it results in shaming, and he'll even go so far as to say it's like, you're being stupid, or that's stupid, and so we sort of run the gamut. Sometimes it's really subtle, and it's hard for people to pick up that they're being shamed or they're being devalued in this. And when we look at what goes on in the organizational context, it's those challenges to employee accountability when leaders are using this practice unknowingly on their employees. Now, it's not about intentional cruelty, really those subtle behaviors and language, but it chips away at team morale. and at individual morale as well. And it's not like they're intentionally against setting out to hurt people with their behavior. For most of them, it's this unconscious self-protective strategy, right? They don't know how to come at it directly. And so leaders might deflect responsibility or resort to scapegoating during stressful situations or during conflicts. I've heard, stories about some of our clients where they work with colleagues who will say things like after the fact, oh, I never agreed to it, when they did, but because of what's come out afterwards, they're trying to backpedal from it, right? And again, it's that shame. It's like as though you've done something wrong in that dynamic. Now, we also see leaders who will pick people to blame publicly in order to take the heat off of themselves. And ultimately, though, this creates an environment where employees really feel undervalued. They feel fearful, right? They're walking on eggshells, and it leads to that disengagement and a lack of accountability that we're trying to get ahead of in these conversations that we're having.
And I'm really glad you brought that up, Heather, about the unintentionality of this behavior, because a lot of times what leaders will do, if you were to say, oh, that really embarrassed me, or your words really embarrassed me in that meeting, the leaders can turn it around and do another shaming thing where they protect themselves and simply say, oh, you're way too sensitive, and I didn't mean that, and what's wrong with you that you can't take it? And really, leaders often don't realize the impact that their words can have on employees, especially when they're using sarcasm or dismissive comments. And we'll say this often today. I'm sure we'll land on this a number of times, how undermining a leader's words can be of an employee's confidence and sense of value. So, for example, when leaders consistently ignore, minimize an employee's idea in meetings, it can make them feel unimportant. Or like in your example at the beginning, Heather, where they were just so dismissive of someone's attempt to participate and bring forward an idea. And then, of course, there's those sarcastic or disparaging remarks, like making jokes at the expense of an employee that are demeaning to the employee, but the leader believes that they're just being funny. And even failing to acknowledge or downplay an employee's achievements can demoralize them. Comments like, it's just a part of your job. That is so belittling, and it takes away an employee's ability to take pride in their work and really get more engaged, because they love feeling that way. And leaders, without knowing it, they take this away from their employees.
Yeah, and it's forgetting this important aspect of accountability, right? Is that, when we talk about the engage element, right? And having to take action as leaders to make sure that we're maintaining that level of engagement of our employees in and around what they're doing and how they're doing it. And I think a lot of the leaders, and as Anne, you were talking about this, I also think that it's not always just leader to direct report. We see a lot of this behavior that goes on amongst coworkers, and including at the leadership level of the organization. And, especially sarcasm, oh, we're just teasing, it's just the way we are together. And it's like, no, there's a bite to that. There's some cut in there that's a little bit past that, sort of that playful teasing that you might see as part of good, solid camaraderie. And there are leaders today who still believe that shaming employees can be a motivating force. Just like there are teachers who still believe shaming kids in the classroom is going to motivate them and encourage them to do better, but they don't realize and understand that it actually has a negative impact, that it has the reversed effect where it causes people to shut down and to withdraw, which then ultimately impacts productivity and morale. And this stems from a misunderstanding of what it is that truly motivates individuals. And rather than fostering motivation, it actually instills fear. And this is the one thing we don't want in our workplace if we're trying to foster accountability. And it also reduces people's self-esteem. And so their level of security, their confidence starts to drop. And then it also creates mistrust and hostility. And we've seen it in organizations where we've come in and this dynamic has been going on for years, where we've got folks at all levels of leadership who are just too afraid to do anything, to make any decisions, to bring anything forward, to solve issues, for fear of being shamed by their boss or their, that sort of collective group that is in that position of power. And when employees are ultimately, this is going on, it really does backfire, and it really moves the culture and the dynamic of the organization away from where you want to be. And the negative consequences are quite profound. And what we find interesting is that in that environment, people often stay because their self-esteem is dropped. Their level of confidence in their self starts to erode, and they don't feel like they can go anywhere else. And so again, an unintentional, it is a strategy that leaders are using that has a certain impact, but not the one that they think it's going to have. When employees are publicly criticized and belittled for their mistakes, it actually puts in this deep-seated fear of failure, and it can be paralyzing. We see them becoming overly cautious and hesitant to take risks, or resorting to overly explaining and defending everything that they do. And not only does this have an impact or a stifling impact on personal growth, but it hinders accountability and creates that toxic work environment where employees are driven by fear. So, all the things that come with that, the blaming, the finger pointing, the, oh, it's not me, it's you, it's, you get the idea here. This is not a productive way to go about driving accountability in an organization.
And when you think about the thrust in today's organizations for creating psychological safety and creating a culture where everybody thrives, if leaders aren't aware that they're doing this, they actually disrupt the development of a healthy, accountable work culture. And instead of learning from their errors in a constructive manner, employees then get on the defensive or disengage, like you're saying. It creates this fear in people where they shut down. They can start to hide out and not ask questions or downplay their mistakes to avoid further shame. And this, of course, leads to an overall lack of transparency and honesty in the workplace. It's like this snowball effect that begins to happen where, one person is shamed and they tell a coworker, and then they become afraid that the boss is going to do that to them. And ultimately, communication begins to shut down and trust is eroded. And these are essential components of a productive and collaborative team where psychological safety exists. You cannot have psychological safety when you fear being shamed by your boss. In such a climate, employees are less likely to take ownership of their work or feel a sense of belonging and commitment to the organization. Ultimately, of course, affecting the overall performance and morale on the team.
Yeah, and if we look at when we think about accountability and really what we're trying to foster, this unconscious shaming is again working in that opposite direction. And the how it manifests, though, and I think this is one that a lot of employees and leaders alike, they aren't necessarily looking at their language or their behavior through the lens of is my comment or was my behavior in that moment shaming or dismissive or devaluing, right? We see the devaluation quite frequently. And it's a missed opportunity, really, when you're using that approach or that language because you don't know how to shift the conversation or the dialogue, or you're doing it in that more self-protective manner, which is, again, often why it gets triggered. And so leaders will do things like, publicly criticize an employee for a mistake, thinking, oh, I'm showing everybody else what not to do. But instead, they've missed this really valuable opportunity for a constructive conversation around expectations and feedback and true learning. Because remember, this is what this is about. We're always in this environment as leaders, and especially when we're trying to foster accountability and higher levels of performance, is what's the instruction? What's the learning that we need to do in order to improve? It's not just about what is said. Sometimes it's also about what's not said. And we hear a lot of feedback from our clients about the fact that their managers are so quick to point out what's not working and leave out the conversation about so quick to point out what's not working and leave out any conversations about what is working or what are the successes, or to even carry that forward. And as though I said to you, I already told you did a good job on that, we don't need to keep revisiting it. And so they lose sight of the whole performance perspective and just fixate on that isolated incident. And it's that pointing out and that fixation on the false or the negative is another way of, again, keeping employees in that place of thinking, well, I'm just doing it to keep them motivated and I'm just doing them so that they'll keep striving forward. But it has the reverse impact, again, because they start to feel that sense of shame, that sense of, I can't get it right, I can't do anything right. And this actually contributes to that drop in productivity and morale. And we've heard, again, where everything's been great, but the leader fixates and shames them on this one little mistake that was there in the report or the one thing that they did wrong, as opposed to, again, taking it all into consideration. And that's, again, that idea of somehow the leader's putting this employee in their place, or the leader was embarrassed by the mistake. And instead of just acknowledging, hey, I was embarrassed because that mistake was there and it hadn't been caught, it's like, again, that shaming or devaluing of the individual, right? And again, all with that idea, unintentional, unconscious, very important, as Anne and I reinforced that over the course of this. They're not doing it from a place of intent, but that's the impact that it's having.
Yeah, I remember this one very well from my childhood when and back when I was in school, we would get A, B, C, D, or E on a report card, and I'd come home with a whole whack of A's on my report card, and not get praised for it. But my sibling, who would get a couple of A's, would be overpraised. And when I asked my mother about it, she said, well, you're so smart, I don't want you to get a swelled head. And, your sibling needs encouragement. That's why I give them more attention. As though I didn't need the same level of praise for my hard work, because the assumption was it came easy to me. And this mindset around, you don't want to get your people too confident, or you don't want them to get a swelled head. If a leader is coming from that place, they will have a bias toward the negativity. They will focus more on that little thing of, you might have done all of that well, but you still aren't doing this right, which, on the one hand, it will acknowledge what you've done, but it will bring them down and take the wind out of their sails in the same breath. And many employees report feeling ashamed when their leaders are overcritical without providing constructive advice, support, or pointing out what they're doing right. And similarly, they can imply incompetence by saying, I'll have to get someone else to fix this after a mistake. And this can lead to the employee believing they're not capable of even fixing their own mistakes. And then, of course, generalizations or stereotyping based on age, gender, or background all impact psychological safety, leading to fear and anxiety, and leading to a lack of psychological safety, which finally, you can see all the layers to that. There goes the accountability, because people who are fearful do not rise to any sort of engagement or innovation or taking any risks at all. And lastly, an indifference to an employee's personal circumstances, such as saying things like, I don't care about your personal issues, just get the work done, take that to somebody else who who quote unquote cares, because they're just demonstrating that they have no empathy, and they disregard the employee's overall total well-being.
So now that we've talked about all the ways in which this wonderful unconscious habit of shaming shows up from leaders and in organizations, we want to talk a little bit about why does this happen? Why is it there? And this kind of sets the stage for getting into what it is that you need to do to focus development if you're the one that's doing this, or you work with other leaders who are doing this, in order to help them become more aware of the issues they're creating with their unconscious behavior. So we've identified the top 4 reasons that leaders shame employees, and this is what we're going to continue our conversation on around at this point in time. So first of all, the very first one is because the behavior is unconscious, remember that, a lack of emotional intelligence is most likely to be at the root of why they resort to shaming. And for sure, there is that element of, this is how I was spoken to, and so I carry it on, but I haven't learned, that the impact that this has, the impact on others. I haven't learned other language that I can use instead of this. And leaders with low emotional intelligence, they really do struggle with understanding and managing their emotions and empathizing with their team members. And as Ann had said earlier, they're really quick to say, oh, that shouldn't have bothered you, or you're being too sensitive, and again, moving into that place of dismissing as opposed to staying with it and understanding it and really considering the impact of their behavior. So when they don't recognize and regulate their own emotional responses to what's going on, because remember, there's always a trigger that leads this person to use unconscious shaming, right? And if they're not aware of that emotional trigger, the leaders may inadvertently harm their relationships with employees and the overall team dynamics by using unconscious shaming. So a great leader or a leader may think they're being funny by dismissing an employee's suggestion with a sarcastic, great idea, Einstein, but that undermines their confidence and contribution. So what's the trigger? We have to learn how to manage those triggers.
And a lot of times, people use this, I'm trying to be funny, to be your buddy, to soften the blow when it actually exacerbates the blow by saying something like, as you said, Heather, great idea, Einstein. It sounds funny, but inside that employee shrinks, a part of them shrinks, and then they have to put on their persona. And the generation, the number of power struggles that get generated by sarcastic comments and off the cuff comments, as though you've had a couple of beer and you're talking to a buddy or a girlfriend at a bar. It's just phenomenal, the negative impact that this has in organizations. And in addition to that lack of development around emotional intelligence, leaders are just not trained in leadership and in communication. Many leaders ascend to their positions based on technical expertise or seniority, not on their ability to manage people or understand the impact of their behavior on their employees. And lacking the necessary training in empathetic or active listening or communication and people management, they default to shaming or harsh criticism when faced with challenging situations, not really understanding the impact of their words and actions on morale, performance, and accountability. They're meeting their need to be in control by acting out instead of figuring out what training they need to deal with their issues more effectively.
Yeah, and we see this play out, right? And it's again a developable skill, right? To sort of break this habit of using unconscious shaming is a developable skill, to Anne's point, with training. And what we see most often is that leaders use this as a defense mechanism, in essence, to mask personal insecurities, cope with stress. I mean, I've seen it where, in a room with a CEO, where because they weren't understanding what was being talked about, that going on the attack and shaming the other person for, why would you possibly bring this forward? And how could you think that this is something that we would ever do? And, as opposed to simply saying, I need more time to take this in. And that's what we say is when you are at the receiving end of someone who's using unconscious shaming or the devaluing, is what is it that's going on in that actually leader, that they're using it in that self-protective defense mechanism sort of way. And again, if they're feeling uncertain about their own leadership capabilities or feeling uncertain in that situation, they may unconsciously project those feelings onto the employees, and that's what you're picking up on. And that projection can manifest as shaming, belittling behavior. The leader deflects from, attention from their insecurities by focusing on the perceived shortcomings of their team members. High levels of stress, conflict, pressure can also resort to leaders to shaming. And I've even seen it with real, leaders who are typically more effective and in a high stress situation, increasing their use of this because they're having, that's like, I need to get this feeling out of me. And so they're dumping it out, as we say, dumping it out on others. In environments where the leaders might be feeling overwhelmed, again, other triggers that will cause them to resort to these negative behaviors. And again, with that misguided belief that this is somehow going to drive performance, address the gaps, help the organization to meet its goals. And this approach really, it backfires, because what it does is it leads to a decrease in employee engagement and productivity. It leads to an escalation of, conflict, what we often see people talk about as personality conflicts between leaders and direct reports. And, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is, when we think about fostering accountability, is we need that environment where employees feel confident and secure in their relationship with their leader, and the unconscious shaming, regardless of the cause of it or the root behind it, gets in the way of that.
And, at the final point that we're going to talk about that really contributes to this practice is that if it's acceptable within a culture, new leaders are much more likely to adopt the behaviors. And we've worked in organizations where it's a standard practice to, as Heather mentioned earlier, tell someone that their idea was stupid, or that it's ridiculous to think a particular way. And everyone goes along with it. And new leaders then begin to adapt and just to take on these shaming practices. And it goes all the way down through the levels of the organizations. And for those of you in our audience that think, this doesn't happen in more enlightened cultures, you are absolutely wrong. This happens everywhere. People are very judgmental, especially when it's acceptable. And in cultures where harsh criticism and public shaming and aggressive management styles are normalized and even rewarded, we just set the stage for a lack of psychological safety for employees and people thinking this is just the way that we do things around here. It creates this vicious cycle where aggressiveness like this is accepted, shaming is accepted. And even though it's dysfunctional, this is the way we manage performance. This is the way we motivate our people. And however, when leaders unconsciously shame their staff through phrases like I mentioned, this is ridiculous, or can't you do anything right, or is that all you've got done? They create a culture of fear and silence instead of that culture of accountability that they are so looking to cultivate. It harms the individual's self-esteem, impedes the team's ability to collaborate, and it really does a disservice to the leader because it tends to undermine everything that the leader is doing right.
Yeah, it's interesting as you were talking about that. I was thinking another example. We see this often where there's this collective shaming of a particular function or devaluation of a particular function or a group of people. And the language can be things like, well, the girls from that group department, or, where, they're held to a different standard. I know we've worked with it in organizations where, some of the functions can go over their budget by hundreds of thousands of dollars, and another function, because it's a devalued function within the organization, because the leaders don't understand it well, or there's something else that's going on there where they're a dollar over and they're taken to task. And so it's something to think about when you're looking at this and considering where it exists in your organization and with your leaders. Is it can be directed towards an individual, it can be directed towards a group of individuals, a function within the organization. And it really, when it is directed at the function, it gets in the way of that collaboration and cross-departmental or interdependent cohesiveness that businesses require from all of their different functional areas. And so the language you use is very important. And again, it's unconscious. And so I often see it where the leaders don't understand the work of that other function, or they believe their function is more important versus others. And this is the places where it tends to come up. So with that, it's time to drop our gem for today's podcast. And we're going to provide you with some insight that you can take away and begin to work with right away. And it really is essential for organizations and for individuals, right? Because this, as soon as you start to see that this behavior is going on around you, it allows you to actually respond differently in the moment to it, and also not to personalize that behavior. Start to recognize it, name it, and recognize it for what it is. And we have to actively work to address these subtle yet detrimental behaviors, because they are damaging. It has a damaging impact on the team, and in particular in this context of our conversation on accountability. Central to this is the development of emotional intelligence. And as we know, it is the cornerstone to effective leadership, that ability to understand and manage one's emotions and to be empathetic in the engagement of feelings of others, right? And really think about the impact of our behavior, or that our words will have on other people. Leaders with high emotional intelligence are more adept at assessing the impact of their words and actions, and choosing their words in a way that has the intended impact. And that allows them to uplift rather than to demean. And they can provide feedback that's not only constructive, but is also encouraging. And that fosters an environment where mistakes are seen as opportunities for growth and for learning, rather than as failures to be shamed. And they really do need leaders. We need to be aware of their behavior and its effect on their team. And that includes recognizing those overt signs on the team of disengagement or dissatisfaction, and picking up on those more nuanced expressions of discomfort or demoralization that can result from unintended shaming happening in your workplace.
And on that note of wisdom, that's a wrap for this episode of Dismantling Dysfunction. As always, we're your hosts, Heather Dranitsaris, and myself, Dr. Ann Dranitsaris. Thank you so much for listening and being a part of our audience. And we really hope you'll join us again for our next episode, where we explore the hidden blockers to accountability caused by leaders who bully. You know, you can see the theme that we're on here with leaders' unconscious behavior. We'll discuss how the need to be in control and have power over others to feel psychologically secure causes leaders to dominate instead of lead. Remember, if you're feeling challenged by the accountability gaps in your organization, or the behaviors of some of your leaders that aren't getting you the results that you want to get, and want to know more about what you can do about it, you can contact us for a consultation. We'll talk to you about your issues, how we can help you, some steps that you can take to dismantle the dysfunction that causes failure of accountability in your organization.
Thank you for investing your valuable time in listening and gaining insights into the competencies that leaders need to master to set that stage set the stage for breaking this unconscious habit of using shaming in their efforts to drive accountability, or their misguided efforts to drive accountability, and instead looking at developing up other techniques and other practices for doing so. As always, you can catch all of our videos on LinkedIn Live. Our podcasts are also available, and our past videos are also available on our YouTube channel. So make sure again that you are subscribed to our channel, that you're subscribed to our podcast so you don't miss a single episode. All of that can be found on our website, Dranitsaris-Hilliard.com. And if you're catching the video, it's running in the feed as well. And if you found this information valuable, if you find this information helpful, please give this video a thumbs up or share it with other leaders who you believe can benefit from it. Again, thank you for being in our audience, and we look forward to having you back in it real soon.
Thank you for listening to the Dismantling Dysfunction podcast with Dr. Ann Dranitsaris and Heather Dranitsaris-Hilliard, organizational development and behavioral change experts. Be sure to subscribe to get more practical insights and focused tools to help you dismantle dysfunction in your organizations, leaders, or relationships. For more information, visit dismantlingdysfunction.com.